For you, first and foremost, it's kind of a unique opportunity today. First ever chance to do an engagement listening session, a congressional one, ever, and it happens right here in your backyard. So just why was something like today so important for you?
Well, I think it was just a great session, and hearing directly from athletes and from these colleges and universities, people who are impacted by a lot of these changing and trends that are happening in college sports these days between NIL and the transfer portal. There's no substitute for hearing directly from the people who are most impacted, and that's going to be these student athletes. So I was really glad that we were able to do it here in South Dakota, that the president of the NC2A was willing to come here and offer his input and listen. I thought we got a lot to chew on today, and it's pretty clear to me that we need to start moving forward and coming up with at least some solutions that create transparency around these issues, so that it can be done in a way that doesn't create the wrong incentives and get each school kind of trying to outrace and outcompete the other one based on state laws they can pass to give them a competitive advantage. I think the thing you need to have is a framework where everybody's kind of playing by the same set of rules, and that came through loudly and clearly today.
You mentioned a couple of the buzzwords here with NCAA athletics, college athletics in general, and that is NIL, transfer portal. You're just getting acclimated with President Baker now. He's not been on the job all that long. He's walking in at a very interesting time, to say the least. So what are your first impressions of him, and how open has he been to discussion on these particular topics?
Really open, and he came into my office in Washington a while back, and we had a really good conversation around him trying to find consensus among the schools before coming to Congress with recommendations, and we kind of tried to touch on that today, how important it is that as a leader, and he's a leader who has a lot of experience in a state, a complicated state of Massachusetts as a governor. I think he brings a perspective and a style and a skill set that's oriented toward trying to find consensus. And I think that's what it's going to take, because if you have if the conferences are in different places, if the Division I, Division II, Division III schools are in different places, it's really going to take, I think, a clear-eyed focus on what are those basics that we can include and incorporate into a framework that puts some guardrails around this, allows these athletes to be compensated and valued for the contributions that they're making and that their name, image, and likeness brings to the school, but do it in a way that's transparent, and so that there aren't incentives for bad behavior. And he's really, I think, focused on that, and I think is the right person at the right time.
When it comes to the legislative part of this, obviously there's particular interest for you in that area. What is Congress's involvement in something like this, and is it a matter of finding a balance between allowing the NCAA to operate on its own and helping out in whatever way you see fit?
I think the main thing, for Congress at least, there are a couple things, and I mentioned some of what I think are the broad components that should be in a potential solution. But I think the challenge you run into, and he outlined it, is the states, if they adopt separate laws, and many of them are. I mean, you see what Missouri's done, Louisiana's done, Texas has done. You look at some of these state laws, and they're going to be very much at conflict or at odds with what the NCAA might be telling the schools or the conferences to do. And so you've got to create, if you're going to have rules of the road that are sort of uniform, it's probably going to take Congress to create that. Otherwise, it'll be 50 states with 50 different regimes and many conferences that span multiple states. The SEC's 11 states, Summit League, Missouri Valley. Those are all conferences that have multiple states, and so if every state's doing something different to try and give the schools in their state a competitive disadvantage over the other one, you're going to have this just crazy system out there, and I think it's going to create a lot of incentives for bad behavior. So I think that there is a role for Congress. I think the key is trying to find consensus. Congress typically doesn't act if there's a lot of disunity out there, division, and if these schools can kind of come together behind basic things like a uniform standard contract, for example, or the fact that we're not going to allow these schools to create an employee-employer relationship with the athletes. Those are a basic construct, I think, that can work. And I'm hoping we can find some consensus around some things like that. And then preempting states too, so that there's a uniform way of doing it.
Speaking of states, obviously South Dakota is your top priority, and as you look at all of this, not to mention what goes with it sometimes in the conference realignment discussion that's going on hot and heavy right now, how do you approach it personally, and just trying to protect the best interests. We're obviously a lower level Division I state and Division II, Division III, NAIA, these schools. How do you protect what's best for your state and the institutions within it?
Well, and that's the thing. You always have to have an eye toward as you trying to come up with answers is how is this going to translate or how is this going to play out? And I think right now, at least, for the South Dakota schools, doing nothing is the worst case scenario. I think that everybody benefits from having some transparency, some accountability to make sure that when somebody hits the transfer portal, that it's not a pay-to-play thing, that somebody on the other side isn't saying, I'll give you $1 million to come here, that if they're, it keeps everything on the up and up. And I think that benefits everybody. But with respect to South Dakota, my concern has always been, for our Division I programs here, if the Power 5 conferences are starting to offer $1 million contracts basically to some of these athletes, I mean, how does that affect our recruiting? And if somebody can hit the transfer portal and go to a school that offers them that kind of an incentive, are we going to start bleeding our good student athletes? They might get a year or two up here. And so I'm trying to think through some of those ramifications and how we keep, as best we can, an environment here, an atmosphere where our kids are, want to stay and want to compete and play here in South Dakota. And of course, in the Division II level, same basic principles, slightly different ways in which they're applied. But I think because we have a lot of division schools and smaller schools in that, NAIA, and the two big Division I schools, they had some of these things that are happening right now. We're still trying to get an assessment of how that's going to play out. I mean, I look at it and say, for example, SDSU or USD, and in basketball and football, we've been losing some of these athletes that are going to Arkansas or Alabama or Creighton, and yet we're also getting some kids that maybe tried it at an Oklahoma State or a Colorado and now coming back our way. And so it's net. I'm not sure in the end how what the ultimate impact is, but I do know this: I think it's really important that everybody's playing by the same rules, and so that if there's not a pay-to-play environment out there where schools that have big endowments or lots of donors can just outbid the other ones. I think you've got to know what the rules are, have a standard contract, make sure it doesn't become an employer thing where these programs are not going to be able to be funded anymore, and then a lot of them are going to go by the wayside, and have it uniform so that each state isn't doing its own thing differently.
Well, it's a lot of tough topics, Senator, and so I certainly appreciate the fact that people out there probably take some solace in the fact that they know the right ears are listening and paying attention and hearing these concerns that people have about this, because it is a new age of college athletics, certainly. So thank you for investing the time and energy into hearing everyone out today.
Appreciate that, Jay, and thank you for covering it today and giving us a chance to hear those student athletes talk about a subject that I think is going to be really important to all of us down the road.